The hospital doors flew open as Greg and Susan burst in, carrying their limp son, Tommy, in their arms. Susan's face was pale, her lips trembling with fear, while Greg's eyes darted around, desperate for help. The ER was bustling with activity, nurses rushing between patients, the sound of beeping machines and distant chatter filling the room. "Please, someone help!" Greg's voice cracked, heavy with panic. A nurse, Naomi, noticed them immediately and approached. She had been working at the hospital for over a decade, her calm demeanor a testament to her experience. Naomi was used to emergencies, and she could already see the boy needed immediate attention. "Let's get him to a bed," Naomi said softly, motioning them toward an empty gurney. Her voice was steady, reassuring. Susan glanced at Naomi, her eyes narrowing slightly. She hesitated. For a brief second, something darker flashed across her face. She stared at Naomi, taking in her dark skin, her neatly tied hair under her cap, and without a word, she pulled Tommy tighter into her arms. I don't want her touching him," Susan stammered, her voice low but laced with a biting edge. Greg looked at her, confused. "What?" "Susan, we don't have time for this. He's getting worse." His voice was desperate, pleading. "No," Susan said, firmer this time. "I don't want her treating my son." Naomi stopped, her hands frozen midair. The room seemed to still for a moment. The weight of Susan's words hung heavily between them. Greg blinked, not quite understanding what was happening. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "She's here to help." "Susan." "I said no." Susan snapped, her voice trembling now. She avoided Naomi's gaze, looking past her as if she weren't even in the room. "We need someone else. Please." "Anyone else?" Greg looked at Naomi apologetically, but his confusion was evident. "She's just scared," he muttered, trying to smooth over the situation. "We're all scared. Please, can you?" Naomi, maintaining her professionalism, nodded. She had seen this before. Racism wasn't new to her. It came in all forms, subtle, blatant, and everything in between. But it stung just the same, no matter how prepared she thought she was. "I understand," Naomi said, her voice level. "But your son needs immediate attention. His breathing is shallow, and his color's fading. We can't waste time." She kept her eyes on Tommy, refusing to let the mother's prejudice affect her professionalism. Susan shook her head violently. "No, I don't want you treating him. I don't want you anywhere near him." Greg stepped closer to his wife, frustration boiling over. "This is insane. Our son is in trouble. She's a nurse. She knows what she's doing. Then why don't they send someone else?" Susan hissed through clenched teeth, still not looking at Naomi, as if her very presence was an affront. "There's plenty of other staff here. Why her?" Naomi clenched her hands, the insult sharp but not unfamiliar. This wasn't about her qualifications. It never was. Taking a deep breath, she straightened up. "I'll call the doctor," Naomi said, her voice steady. But the quiet humiliation burned beneath her calm exterior. "Dr. Reynolds will be here shortly." She turned, leaving the room without another word, feeling the stares from other patients and staff on her back. Each step she took felt heavier than the last. She had been through this before, yet it never got easier. That bitter taste in her mouth, the anger rising in her chest. It always lingered long after moments like these. In the treatment room, Susan paced back and forth, hugging Tommy close. Greg stood frozen, glaring at her. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed. "He's getting worse. You're letting. I'm protecting him." Susan snapped, tears welling up in her eyes. I just don't feel comfortable. You don't know these people. We don't know her." Greg's hands balled into fists. "She's a nurse. A trained nurse. Do you really think they'd let her work here if she wasn't capable?" Susan's lips quivered. "I'm just asking for someone else, Greg. Someone who understands us. Who gets our family. Why is that too much to ask?" Greg let out a sharp breath, his frustration palpable. "You're asking for someone white. Just say it, Susan. You think a black nurse can't take care of him. Is that it?" Susan flinched but didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. Just then, the door opened and Dr. Michael Reynolds stepped in, tall, with an air of authority, His presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere. Greg's tension eased slightly, believing the doctor would side with them. Susan visibly relaxed, finally seeing someone she thought would fix the situation. "Doctor, thank God you're here," Greg said, relief flooding his voice. "Our son is very sick. Please, can you help?" Dr. Reynolds glanced at Naomi's chart notes before looking up at them. His expression was unreadable. "I understand you refused treatment from Nurse Naomi," he said calmly. "Is that correct?" Susan straightened up, defensiveness creeping back into her posture. I wanted someone else. Someone more." "More what?" Dr. Reynolds interrupted, his tone neutral but sharp. He wasn't giving her the out she was looking for. Susan faltered. "Someone more suited." "Naomi is one of our most skilled nurses," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice firm. "If you refuse her care, you're refusing mine as well." The room went silent. Susan's mouth fell open, unable to process what she was hearing. Greg's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" Susan whispered, shocked. "You heard me," Dr. Reynolds said, his gaze unwavering. "If you don't let her treat your son, I will not be involved either. This hospital doesn't tolerate discrimination. Your son needs help, and she is the best person to give it." Susan stared at him, speechless. Greg took a step forward, his voice shaking. "Please, Susan, we need to do what's best for Tommy. You need to let go of this." For the first time, Susan's resolve faltered. She glanced at Tommy, whose breathing had grown shallow. The weight of her decision pressed on her like never before. The silence in the room was suffocating. The room felt colder, heavier. Susan stood frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around Tommy, while Greg stared at her, his expression a mix of desperation and anger. Dr. Reynolds remained composed, watching the tension build as seconds slipped away. Tommy's breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling with difficulty. Susan's mind raced, her heart pounding. She had never been confronted like this, never been forced to question herself so directly. The doctor's words echoed in her head, discrimination. Was that what this was? No, she thought. She wasn't a racist, she just didn't trust this woman, not with Tommy. She convinced herself that it was about something else, anything else. But Greg's voice cut through her internal struggle. "Susan, enough," he said, his voice low and strained. "Look at him. He's getting worse. You're letting this thing get in the way of our son's health. Do you even hear yourself?" Tears welled up in Susan's eyes, but she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. "I just don't trust her, Greg. I can't explain it, I just don't." Greg let out a sharp breath, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "You don't have to trust her. You just need to let her do her job. Naomi knows what she's doing. You're not a doctor, Susan. You don't get to make this call." Susan's eyes flickered toward Dr. Reynolds, who stood silent, waiting. There was no judgment in his face, no anger, just a firm resolve that made her feel small. It wasn't what he was saying that made her uncomfortable. It was the fact that he wasn't backing down, that her usual ways of avoiding confrontation weren't working here. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but commanding. "Your son needs immediate care, Mrs. Baker. The longer you wait, the more dangerous this becomes. You have a choice to make." The words hit her like a weight. A choice, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like she was being forced into a corner, exposed, her carefully crafted world crumbling under the pressure of this moment. Her pulse quickened, her throat tightening. She hated how everyone was staring at her, waiting for her to change her mind, to admit something about herself that she wasn't ready to face. Susan whispered, barely audible. She felt the sting of humiliation rise in her chest. "I'm scared." Greg's face softened, but only slightly. "We all are, Susan. But you're not thinking straight. We have to trust them. Trust her." Susan's hands trembled as she looked down at Tommy. His skin was paler than before, his eyelids fluttering. Her stomach twisted with fear, but also with shame. Deep down, a part of her knew Greg was right, that her fear wasn't about Tommy at all. But she couldn't shake the years of ingrained prejudice that now clung to her, suffocating her judgment. I don't want to be wrong," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward again, this time softer, more measured. No one's asking you to be wrong, Mrs. Baker. We're asking you to do what's best for your child. Susan's chest tightened. She glanced at Naomi, who had re-entered the room quietly, her eyes steady but distant, as if she'd already braced herself for another rejection. The humiliation hit Susan in full force then. This woman, this nurse, had done nothing wrong. She had only tried to help. And yet Susan had turned her into an enemy, into a symbol of her own fear and prejudice. Naomi stood at the edge of the room, hands folded in front of her, waiting patiently. It would have been easy for her to walk away, to hand the case to someone else, but she didn't. And Susan knew, deep down, that she was the only one who had failed here. A long, painful silence filled the room. Greg squeezed Susan's arm gently, his voice soft but insistent. "Susan, please." "For Tommy." Susan swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mind racing. Everything in her wanted to hold on to her fear, to keep control. But Tommy's soft wheezing pulled her out of it. The sound of her son struggling to breathe was louder than her pride, louder than the wall she had built over the years. She couldn't let this be the reason he didn't get the care he needed. "Okay," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. She loosened her grip on Tommy and lowered him onto the gurney. "Okay." Naomi stepped forward without hesitation, immediately getting to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Greg exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing as he watched Naomi's steady hands check Tommy's vitals and prepare him for the next steps. Susan stood back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The humiliation burned hot under her skin, but she forced herself to watch. Naomi was calm, focused. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, but with a gentleness that made Susan's stomach twist with guilt. She realized she had projected her own insecurities onto this woman, who was now doing everything possible to save Tommy. Greg walked over to Susan, his expression softer now. "You did the right thing," he whispered. She nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. She had done the right thing, but why did it feel like she had failed? As Naomi continued to work, the beeping of the machines filling the room, Susan felt the tears she had been holding back begin to fall. Greg reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. In that moment, Susan realized it wasn't just Tommy who needed healing. Something inside her had broken too, something deep, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. The room buzzed with a tense quiet as Naomi worked swiftly on Tommy, her movements efficient, precise. Every beep from the machines monitoring his vitals echoed louder than normal, each one a reminder of how critical the situation was. Greg stood near the foot of the bed, eyes darting from Tommy to Naomi, then to Susan, who had retreated into herself, arms wrapped tightly around her body, her eyes glued to the floor. Dr. Reynolds observed from the corner, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He could feel the weight of what had just transpired, the subtle, unsaid acknowledgement that the room wasn't just filled with medical tension, but with something deeper. The prejudice, the hesitation, the unspoken discomfort. Everything hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Naomi, for her part, remained composed. She'd seen this too many times to let it affect her care. Her focus was on Tommy, on ensuring his airway remained clear, on stabilizing his breathing. But as she moved, she could feel Susan's gaze lingering on her. Naomi didn't look up, didn't engage, knowing that any glance could reopen the wound of humiliation that had just been inflicted. Instead, she focused entirely on the boy. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor slowly became steadier, more consistent, and Tommy's small chest began to rise and fall in a more regular pattern. His breathing was stabilizing, but the atmosphere in the room remained tight with tension. "His breathing's improving," Naomi said softly, not lifting her eyes from the task. "He's responding to the treatment. We'll need to monitor him closely, but he's out of immediate danger." Greg let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thank God," he whispered, relief washing over him. He moved closer to Tommy, his hand brushing over his son's hair, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes now attached to his frail body. Susan, however, remained rigid. She blinked slowly, watching Naomi, unable to shake the growing sense of shame inside her. She knew Naomi had just saved Tommy's life. There was no question about that, but the emotions swirling inside her were too complicated to untangle. The humiliation still stung. She had misjudged Naomi, and now she had no idea how to face it. Naomi finally stepped back, wiping her hands on a cloth, her job complete for the moment. She glanced briefly at Dr. Reynolds, who gave her a small nod. She had done well, as she always did. Yet, the tension in the room still gnawed at her. She knew this wasn't over, not the medical part, but the unspoken conflict. It wasn't something that would disappear simply because the boy was breathing normally again. Naomi turned to leave, her face calm, but her heart heavy. As she reached the door, Susan's voice broke the silence. "Wait," Susan whispered, barely audible. Naomi paused, her back still to the room, her hand on the door handle. She hesitated, unsure whether to turn around or just keep going. This was always the hardest part, the aftermath. The moments where she had to stand, stoic, while people dealt with their own demons. But something in Susan's voice made her stop. Susan swallowed hard, her throat dry, words catching in her mouth. I just wanted to say, thank you." The room seemed to hold its breath. Greg glanced at Susan, surprised by the crack in her voice, the vulnerability creeping into her usually firm demeanor. Naomi turned slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softening just a little. She had heard these apologies before, some genuine, others forced. She could always tell the difference. This one wasn't perfect, but there was something real in the hesitation, the struggle Susan was clearly going through. "You're welcome," Naomi said, her voice even, but kind. Susan dropped her eyes again, feeling the burn of tears she was too proud to let fall. It wasn't enough, she knew that. A simple thank you wasn't enough to undo what had happened, but it was all she could muster. The shame was still too fresh. Naomi gave a final nod to Dr. Reynolds, signaling that she was done for now, and left the room. The door clicked softly behind her, but her presence lingered, the weight of what had happened pressing down on everyone. Greg, sensing the stillness in the room, turned toward Dr. Reynolds. "Thank you, doctor, for everything. You stood up for her, and you saved our boy." His voice wavered with emotion, his gratitude spilling over. But there was something else, guilt. Guilt for what had almost happened, for how close they came to letting their own ignorance get in the way. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, his expression serious but not unkind. He studied the couple for a moment before speaking. "This isn't about me, or even Naomi. It's about you, about what you need to take away from this." Susan finally looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. She didn't know what to say. She had never been forced to confront something so deeply rooted in her before, and now that it was laid bare, she felt exposed, fragile. I didn't want to." Dr. Reynolds held up a hand gently. "I understand you're scared, but let me tell you something." His voice softened, as if he was about to share something deeply personal. "When I was a child, I was denied treatment for something serious. I almost died because the nurse refused to touch me. She didn't want to treat a black child." Greg and Susan stared at him, stunned into silence. Susan's breath caught in her throat. Dr. Reynolds continued, his gaze steady. "If it weren't for a doctor who finally stepped in, I wouldn't be standing here today. In that moment, it shaped my entire life. I became a doctor because I never wanted another child to go through what I did. I never wanted someone to feel that their life was worth less because of their skin color." Susan's face turned white, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. She blinked rapidly, trying to absorb the gravity of what he was saying. Her heart pounded, a mixture of shame and something else, something she couldn't quite name yet. Dr. Reynolds' eyes didn't leave hers as he spoke again, his voice firm but gentle. "You almost let your son suffer because of something you were too scared to face. You need to think about that. Not for me, not for Naomi, but for him, for Tommy." The room fell silent again, the only sound the soft beeping of the machines. The air was thick with the weight of the truth, and there was no escaping it now. Susan's lips trembled as she nodded, unable to speak. She knew what she had almost done. She knew how close she had come to making a mistake that could never be undone. Greg reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We need to change, Susan. We can't be this way." For the first time in a long while, Susan didn't argue. She simply nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The quiet hum of the hospital filled the space as the weight of Dr. Reynolds' words hung heavily in the air. Susan sat in the small plastic chair next to Tommy's bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Greg stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, both of them lost in the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed the last few hours. Tommy was stable now, his breathing calm and rhythmic, but the tension in the room was far from lifted. It clung to them like a fog, the events of the day still sinking in. Susan wiped at her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. The shame she felt was overwhelming, crashing over her in waves she hadn't expected. The thought that her own prejudice had nearly cost her son his life was suffocating. Greg squeezed her shoulder gently, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed enough to break through the thick silence. He wanted to comfort her, but he also knew that this moment was about more than just their son's recovery. It was about the harsh truths they had both been forced to confront. "Hey," Greg said softly, breaking the stillness. "Tommy's going to be okay. That's what matters, right?" Susan nodded weakly, though her eyes remained fixed on Tommy's small, fragile frame. She wanted to believe that everything would go back to normal now that he was getting better, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't. It couldn't, not after what had happened. I didn't see it before," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't see how ugly it all was." "How ugly I was?" Greg knelt down beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Susan, it's not just you. We both got it wrong. I stood there and let it happen. I should have stopped it. We let our fear and everything else cloud what really mattered." She shook her head, wiping away another tear. "But it was me. I was the one who... I just couldn't." "You can't change what's already done," Greg interrupted, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "But we can learn from it. We have to. For Tommy." Susan bit her lip, trying to steady herself, but the guilt weighed too heavily. It wasn't just the shame of what she had said. It was the realization that those thoughts had always been there, lurking under the surface, controlling her in ways she hadn't even noticed. She had always considered herself a good person, but today she had seen a side of herself she wished she hadn't. "I didn't even think about what she was feeling," Susan murmured, her voice cracking. "I didn't see her as a person, just someone I didn't want near my son. But she's the one who saved him." Greg was silent for a moment, his gaze softening. "We've lived in this bubble for so long, Susan. Never had to face any of this. We thought we were better than that. But today," his voice trailed off, as if the words were too heavy to finish. Susan looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "What do we do now?" Greg didn't have an answer. The road ahead wasn't clear, but he knew that pretending nothing had changed wasn't an option anymore. Something had shifted, and now they had to figure out how to live with that. Before either of them could say more, the door creaked open, and Dr. Reynolds stepped in, his expression calm but serious. He approached Tommy's bed, checking the monitors and looking over the notes Naomi had left. Satisfied with what he saw, he turned his attention to the parents. "He's doing well," Dr. Reynolds said, his tone professional. "We'll keep him overnight for observation, but I'm confident he'll make a full recovery." Greg and Susan both exhaled in relief, though the tension between them remained. "Thank you," Greg said, standing up to shake Dr. Reynolds' hand. "For everything. Not just for Tommy, but for being straight with us." Dr. Reynolds nodded, though there was a seriousness in his gaze. "It wasn't easy for me to say what I did, but I meant it. This hospital has no room for hate or discrimination. We work together as a team, and I won't let anyone treat my staff or any of our patients like they're less than they are." Susan flinched at the subtle reminder of her earlier behavior. She looked up at Dr. Reynolds, her voice shaky but genuine. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was scared, and I didn't realize what I was doing. But I see it now. I do." Dr. Reynolds studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "Fear does strange things to people, Mrs. Baker. But the important thing is that you learn from it. We all have our biases, whether we admit it or not. It's how we deal with them that makes the difference. Susan nodded, her throat tight. I know. And I'm sorry for what I said. To Naomi, I don't know if I can ever make it right. You can start by acknowledging it, Dr. Reynolds said simply, and by making sure it doesn't happen again. Naomi doesn't need an apology. What she needs is for people like you to recognize her worth, without having to prove it. His words landed hard, and Susan swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had never thought of it that way before, but now it was all so painfully clear. Naomi had been forced to prove herself, not as a nurse, but as a person. And Susan had made that harder than it ever should have been. I'll try, Susan whispered. I'll do better. Dr. Reynolds nodded once more, his gaze softening. That's all anyone can ask. He turned to leave, but Greg called out, stopping him at the door. Doctor, wait. I don't know if you'll understand this, but Greg hesitated, glancing at Susan before continuing. I didn't just see you as our doctor today. I saw you as someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what's right. And I needed that. We needed that. Dr. Reynolds met Greg's gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. I appreciate that, he said, his voice steady. But you don't need someone else to stand up for what's right. You can do it yourselves. With that, he left the room, leaving Susan and Greg in silence once again. But this time, the silence wasn't as heavy. It was full of something else, possibility, the possibility of change, of growth, of a life lived differently from this point forward. Susan looked down at Tommy, watching his small chest rise and fall, and for the first time in hours, she felt something loosen inside her. Maybe this was the beginning of something better, something honest. Greg sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The path forward was unclear, but they would walk it together, no longer blind to the things they had once refused to see. The weight of the day remained, but somewhere in the depths of their hearts, a shift had begun. And they knew, somehow, that they would never be the same again. The morning light filtered through the hospital room's small window, casting a soft glow over Tommy's bed. His breathing was steady now, the machines no longer beeping with urgency. Susan sat beside him, her fingers lightly stroking his hair, her face showing exhaustion but also relief. Greg stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out into the parking lot below, his mind heavy with everything that had unfolded over the past day. The hospital had quieted down after the chaos of the night before. Nurses passed by occasionally, but Naomi hadn't come back to the room since the incident. Susan's mind replayed the scene over and over. The moment when she had refused Naomi's help, her face twisted in anger and fear. She had been so wrong, and it was a hard pill to swallow. Greg turned from the window, his face softening as he looked at Susan. He's going to be fine, he said, walking over and resting a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing in the end. Susan nodded, though the weight of her guilt hadn't fully lifted. But it shouldn't have taken that long, she whispered. I shouldn't have let it get that far, Greg. She choked on her words, unable to finish the thought. Greg knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. We both made mistakes. But we're here now. We've learned from it. That's what matters. Susan looked down at Tommy, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. She felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of love and regret. Greg was right. They had learned from it. But the realization of how close they came to letting their son's life be put at risk because of their own ignorance haunted her. She knew things had to change, not just for them, but for Tommy's future. A soft knock at the door pulled them both from their thoughts. They turned to see Dr. Reynolds entering the room, his face calm as usual. He glanced at Tommy's chart before meeting their eyes. He's doing well, Dr. Reynolds said, his tone reassuring. We'll keep him for another few hours just to monitor him, but he's on the mend. Greg nodded, standing up and extending his hand again. Thank you, doctor. We really can't thank you enough. Dr. Reynolds shook his hand, but then paused, looking between Greg and Susan. I think it's important to talk about what happened here. I'm glad your son is getting better, but there's more to this than just his recovery. Susan's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation was coming, but she hadn't been ready for it. She lowered her eyes, the shame still fresh. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I made a huge mistake, and I've been thinking about it all night. I can't believe I let my fear and prejudice almost stop the person who was saving my son's life." Dr. Reynolds nodded, his expression gentle but firm. "Recognizing that is the first step. But you have to understand, this isn't just about what happened in that room. It's about what happens every day in so many places. People like Naomi and people like me face this kind of treatment more often than you know. It's ingrained in our society." Greg shifted uncomfortably, but he knew Dr. Reynolds was right. "What can we do to change it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Dr. Reynolds leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "It starts with moments like this, with being honest about what happened, and choosing to do better moving forward. It's about raising Tommy to see the world differently than you did, to understand that people aren't defined by their skin color, but by their actions, their character." Susan wiped away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "I don't want Tommy to grow up the way I did, with these ideas that I never questioned. I want him to be better than me. That's all you can hope for," Dr. Reynolds said softly. "To teach him what you've learned now, so he doesn't make the same mistakes." The door creaked open again, and this time, Naomi stepped inside. Susan's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. Naomi's face was calm, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She nodded at Dr. Reynolds before glancing at Tommy. "I just came to check on him," she said quietly, moving toward the bed. She checked the monitors, her hands steady and professional, but Susan could feel the tension in the air. After a moment, Naomi finished her check and turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, Susan stood up, her voice trembling. "Naomi, wait." Naomi paused, turning back to face her, her expression unreadable. Susan swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you. You saved my son, and I didn't deserve your help. I was wrong." Naomi stood still for a moment, her eyes searching Susan's face. Then slowly she nodded. "I've seen it before," Naomi said, her voice steady but tired. "People's fear can bring out the worst in them. But what matters is what you do after." Susan's tears fell freely now. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Naomi's gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. "It's a start." Dr. Reynolds watched quietly from the side, a sense of resolution settling over the room. There was no grand forgiveness, no sweeping gestures, but there was understanding. There was the promise of something better. Naomi gave one last look at Tommy before she left the room, the door closing softly behind her. Susan collapsed into her chair, emotionally drained, but feeling lighter than she had in hours. Greg sat beside her, his hand on hers, both of them staring at their son with the same thought in mind. They had to be better for him. Hours later, as the paperwork was finalized and Tommy was cleared to go home, Susan and Greg stood by his bedside, packing up his belongings. The sun was higher in the sky now, the warmth of the morning filling the room with light. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Reynolds stopped them at the door. "Take care of him," he said, a slight smile on his face. "And remember what we talked about." "We will," Greg replied, nodding gratefully. Susan met Dr. Reynolds' eyes one last time, and though words failed her, the understanding between them was clear. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. As they walked down the hallway, holding Tommy close, Susan felt a new sense of purpose. She had seen a side of herself she didn't like, but now she had the opportunity to change it, to be better for Tommy's sake, and for her own. The doors to the hospital opened, and they stepped outside, the fresh air filling their lungs. Susan looked down at Tommy, who was stirring awake in her arms, his small face peaceful and unaware of the storm they had weathered. It wasn't just Tommy who had healed that day, and as they walked to the car, Susan knew they were leaving the hospital with something far more valuable than just a healthy son. They were leaving with a lesson that would shape their future. A lesson in humility, in empathy, and in the courage to change,